Do you think it would be a good idea for the central bank to have some kind of rule of keeping credit creation within some boundaries?
In principle, yes. In practice, I am reluctant to be too prescriptive on the rule, because I am something of a fan of what's called Goodhart's law, which is that states that when you start focusing too much on a variable, effectively the economy evolves such to change the meaning of the variable. And I think that's effectively what's happened with CPI. Originally, targeting CPI was a reasonable target. But as the central banks focused on targeting just that flavour of inflation, the asset inflation became more and more dominant and neglected. So if we define a very narrow, specified way of measuring credit creation and ask the central banks to target that, the risk is that over time the structures in the economy evolve and allow credit to be created in another way that hasn't been seen before and is not measured properly. So I'm more in favour of specifying the broad principles but leaving the freedom to adapt those over time as the economy evolves.
How do you see the monetary policy of the European Central Bank compared to that of the United States Federal Reserve Bank?
I think the intellectual framework of the ECB is much superior to that of the Fed. And by that I mean they've got the second pillar of monetary policy, which is to pay a lot of attention to M3 data. I would argue that the M3 data is probably too narrow a measure of money supply or credit supply creation. But they do understand the importance of that. Unfortunately, it's been in academic circles, the appreciation of why it was necessary to focus on that side of policy has been very much out of fashion. And in practical terms, I think it's been very difficult for the ECB to implement policy correctly based on that second pillar. There's been talk out of the ECB about a policy called leaning into the wind, which means that if you think the credit bubble is getting too high, you should be adjusting policy to prevent it from getting excessive. They've talked about that, but I think from a political point of view, it's been quite difficult to follow through on that talk, in large part because the debate, the public debate and the academic debate is not at the point where the necessity to take that preemptive action is understood.
What changes can we expect to see in monetary policy in the future as a result of this financial crisis?
The risk is that the crisis leads not to a reform of the monetary policy, but instead leads to another layer of regulation on the banking system. And the history of regulation is often that with each cycle we put in regulation to deal with the problems of the previous cycle, and we don't anticipate the next cycle. What I think is needed is a broader understanding that these cycles are largely monetary and we need to reform the monetary framework. I don't think that debate has really started yet. So that's not really occurring.
Do you think the length of this crisis will affect the changes in policy?
I think this will be a very long cycle, and therefore we will get gradually more and more policy response. I think the debate is starting to emerge on monetary policy. As yet, I don't think it has really got nearly enough traction. I think for various political reasons, it's politically convenient to to focus on mistakes that were made in the banking industry and the private sector, and to ignore the elements of public sector mistake, which is public sector monetary policy and fiscal policy as well, for that matter. So it's politically convenient to focus on the private sector and ignore the other aspect of the debate. But I think over time there will be a realization that we need to address both sides.
Yeah. What do you think is the main problem with the theoretical framework that today's monetary policy has been based on?
For me, the core problem, and that's in the last part of the title of the book, The Efficient Market Fallacy, the core problem at the root of the bad monetary policy is that the monetary policy is based on a flawed theory that the markets are fundamentally self-stabilizing. This is the efficient market hypothesis. I think that's where what we need to look at and address that, appreciate that financial markets do behave differently to other market systems. Only when we accept that, and only when that gets broad acceptance, can we then step back and say, okay, well, if we accept that truth, now what do we do about it?
In your book, you make several references to a cycle theory called the financial instability hypothesis. But there is another alternative cycle theory called the Austrian business cycle theory. What are your views on this theory?
My views on that, as I said in the lecture today, I think it's a shame that in economics the dialogue seems to have been between the Austrian camp and the efficient market sort of Chicago school camp on one side, with almost no reference to the Keynes-Minsky financial instability hypothesis. When actually, I would say the Austrian cyclical theory and perhaps the Minsky-Keynes theory, there's actually something to be learned from discussing the difference from those two perspectives. They're both inherently cyclical theories. I wouldn't want to comment too much on the details of the Austrian cycle because, frankly, I don't know enough about that theory. But clearly, they're both cyclical theories. The difference is how those two camps recommend dealing with that cyclicality. One is don't deal with it, allow the cycles to form. The other one from the Minsky-Keynes is to manage it, and it's balancing that management.